Good evening and welcome to a very exciting discussion that I've been really looking forward to have. Tonight, we're having as a special guest in FestivalYA organized by Cărturești, Alwyn Hamilton, one of the most beloved YA authors, also translated in Romania, and I'm very happy to greet her. Hello, Alwyn.
Hi, it's lovely to be here. I'm so excited to talk to you tonight.
It's lovely to have you. Everybody who is at the moment in our lovely chat, and we are waiting for you to keep joining us, we would like you to kindly ask you to turn on your cameras if possible, because it's very nice to see you and to be able, at least virtually, to connect to each other. At least when you're asking questions and when you're interacting, this would be really appreciated. And thank you so much, because I'm starting to see faces, which is very nice. So just to make a very brief introduction before I leave the floor to Alwyn, I would like to say that in Romania, there have been 2 installments of the series already published. Rebel of the Suns, translated with Rebelul Nisipurilor, is already out, and Traitor to the Throne, translated by Trădarea Tronului, is a very recent edition in Nemira Publishing House in the Armada imprint. So we're very lucky to have these wonderful books in our lives, translated into Romanian as well, and thank you so much to the translator too. Alwyn, hi.
Hi.
How are you? Tell us a bit about, I don't know, where are you now? How do you feel? What's the vibe in London, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, that's right. I'm in London. I've been in France for most of the beginning of the year because that's where my family is from. So I sort of went for Christmas and then didn't immediately come back. And then things started to get a bit better in the UK and a bit worse in France. So I jumped ship and came back to London. So it's nice to be home, but obviously I miss my parents, but I think we had a good amount of quality time together over Christmas and the beginning of the year.
Yeah, that's great to hear. We were just talking before going live that the pandemic has really affected all of us, and that we are looking forward to see a better situation quite soon. So for those of you who are not really familiar with what Alwyn writes, I'm going to try and summarize a little bit. So in her own words, Alwyn is writing a crossover between Westerns and 1001 Arabian Nights. So this is how often she describes what she's writing, and also with some elements of the French Revolution. Alwyn, but I'm sure that I've read somewhere that this is what you have been studying, right?
Well, as I said, I grew up in France. So the French Revolution, you spend a lot of time on in school when you go to state school in France. It was a big part of the curriculum. So it was sort of always part of my knowledge. And then I kind of fell into it in university again, because I did art history. And every time I sort of was called upon to specialize in something or to, write a dissertation or whatever, it always wound up being sort of around that, quite close to that time, or literally art of the French Revolution. I wrote my final dissertation on Charlotte Corday, depictions of her in art, who is the woman who murdered the famous sort of person of the terror, Marat, in his bathtub by sort of playing all innocent. Why would you fear a 19-year-old girl? Of course, let her in, let her talk to the fearsome head of the revolution. She's not going to stab him to death, which is exactly what she did. So I wrote sort of my dissertation on different depictions of her. So it's kind of been a part of my sort of life and study for a long time, just sort of under there. So I feel like it kind of almost came naturally when I went to write a book that it included a revolution.
There you go. And also very strong female character, which also everybody appreciates, starting with me. Zamani is such a great character. And what I really enjoyed about her is that nothing seems really forced, and that, the writing style is just flowing, and we can picture everything, straight from the beginning. You just delve into the situation. There's a shooting, there's a lot of action, and this kind of pace sort of goes on and on in the whole first book, which I've already read. I confess that the second one is still on my waiting list, although I really, really spoil myself for this conversation. So I'm really sorry now, but what can happen? And I was wondering, how come did you manage to write like this? I mean, if this is your debut novel, how did you manage?
It's my debut novel, but it's definitely not the first thing I ever wrote. I was always writing when I was a kid. I always wanted to be a writer. And then after university, I finally actually finished something and it was bad. And so I left it to one side and I took the lessons that I learned from writing that and I wrote something else. And that was still bad, but slightly better. And so I took the lessons I learned from that and kept going. I always sort of equate it to, you know, playing a sport or a musical instrument. You wouldn't pick up the violin and then expect to be playing, you know, in front of a crowded auditorium immediately. You want to practice. And I think writing's the same. So I did 6 books, full books worth of practice before I wrote Rebel of the Sands.
Whoa.
Yeah, it seems a lot. I wrote them quite quickly. I think I knew that none of them were like the one. So I didn't like waste too much time editing them, except for the 6th one. The 6th book was like so close to being the one. And I was driving myself kind of crazy, trying to fix it, trying to work on it, like, you know, just killing myself. And at the same time, I'd had this other idea, which was about a young female sharpshooter. And I sort of thought on one day when I was writing, I just thought, okay, I'm just going to give myself a break from this book that's making me crazy. And I'm just going to write just the first chapter of the new idea, just to sort of give myself a break, a refresher, and then I'll come back and I'll fix this other book. And then I wrote the first line of Rebel of the Sands, which has basically remained unchanged through all the editions, which in English sort of amounts to Amani saying, I wasn't up to no good, but I wasn't up to no bad either. And she sort of clicked in my brain, and the whole book kind of, not the whole book, but her as a character clicked. And I realized that what had been not working about the book before Rebel of the Sands was how much the plot was driving the character rather than the character driving the plot. And Amani is definitely a plot driver. Like, she's not the type to sort of be like, oh, I guess we're going over here now. Like, she just goes and does the thing. And I think the reason probably why it reads so quick paced is that, you know, anytime that the story wasn't working, I realized it was because she wasn't in motion. She's constantly in motion. She's constantly doing something. She's constantly acting. So I knew her from that first line, and she kind of just went on a roll, and I never went back to that Almost book because I wrote all of Rebel instead of returning to the Almost book.
What's going on now? Don't you miss her now that the series has ended?
I do, but by the same token, because the book was in first person, it was like I was having a conversation with the same person for 3 years. And I kind of, especially by the second and third book, I so wanted to tell readers what was going on with other characters. And when you're in first person, it's hard to do that sometimes. I'd be like, I really want to tell you what, you know, Jin is doing over here, but he can't do that unless she sees it or he tells her. And so I feel like I was really happy with where I left her story. And if I were to ever revisit her, the desert, it would probably be a very different story that would be a multiple point of view sort of thing. But that has its own challenges. But I loved her, but we had our moment.
Yeah, there you go. Do you
now
need
she's
some
everyone
closure?
else's.
Guys, as you have read in the chat, since I don't really intend to have a full dialogue with Alwyn, how much I'd love this, but anyway, you're the guest here. So please, by all means, if you have a question, you can unmute yourselves and ask the question. You can raise your hand using Zoom, or you can just write it in the chat and I will take it. So does anyone have a curiosity right now?
Otherwise, I'll just keep talking. So it might as well be about things that you're interested in. So please do ask. It's always tough to be the first one to ask the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So guys, if you feel like emotional or anything right now or uninspired, you can also feel free to, you know, write in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to be your voice and carry over the question. However, while you are doing this, since I have some notes here, I would also like to ask you guys, who in this chat has read Traitor to the Throne? Okay, we have one hand raised. Okay.
So we better not spoiler it.
Yeah, we have to keep it spoiler free, just with one reader. So I was just going to ask you a very, very interesting question about. Okay, so I have this question in the meanwhile to keep us free from spoilers. When do you think you found your voice in writing?
Ooh, that's interesting, because I think I did the same thing that everyone does when they first start writing. When I first started writing, which was sort of write what I had read or loved and kind of adapt the voice and sort of adopt the voice and stories of other people. I was thinking about this the other day because I have, during the pandemic, I have befriended my 10-year-old neighbor who is a book addict. She's literally cleaned me out of every book appropriate for her age. She's not quite old enough to read my books yet, but she will always borrow a book from me, and then she'll tell me a story that she wants to write, and it's always very similar to the book she's just read. So if she's just read something with a quest in it, she tells me she's going to write a book with a quest. If she's just read something with a boarding school in it, she tells me that she wants to write a book with a boarding school in it. And there's nothing inherently wrong, I think, especially when you're just starting writing, with that, with that approach. Especially, it's why people write fan fiction a lot of the time. A lot of people start in that way. But I think basically it is a practice thing, and I think it was very gradual. I think the Almost book that I talked about was probably the place where I found my voice, because I realized how much I should be writing YA fantasy. When I got out of university and sort of rediscovered YA as a non-YA person, there was a lot of paranormal, there was a lot of contemporary, and I read a lot of that. And so in my mind, I think I was sort of naturally was like, well, that's what YA looks like in fantasy, is adult, because I'd read a lot of adult fantasy, at that time, and I didn't quite know how to reconcile sort of, like the fantasy genre, which can be quite violent and, extreme and complex and things, with YA, until I read Shadow and Bone when that came out, and I was like, oh, you can do fantasy and and YA, and this is how you do it. And I think it sort of gave me the confidence, seeing someone else do it, to do it in my own way. And also, I don't know if everyone's watched the Shadow and Bone TV series. It is excellent. I'm obsessed. I love those books a great deal. But yeah, I think it was about sort of figuring out, like, being given permission to write fantasy, which is what I really wanted to write. And in that, I was then able to find my voice.
Speaking of Shadow and Bone going on TV, I was wondering, because the theme of our YA festival is also screen books and books who managed to get on screen. I was wondering if you'd ever had a proposal, or if you'd love to have your series going on screen.
I would love it. Yeah, I definitely think I would love to see it as a TV series more than a movie, potentially, because there's more scope for that. We've had a couple of different sort of, they call them options, which is the strangest thing, where they basically just give you money to think about making your book into a script, and you're like, okay. I mean, it's not that much money, but they sort of reserve the right to think about your book for sort of a year or 2 years or whatever it is. And at one point, the sort of most interesting one, I guess, was at one point, Will and Jada Pinkett Smith's daughter, wanted to sort of find something to adapt to be her starring YA vehicle, and she sort of bought Rebel for a while to think about playing Amani, but that hasn't necessarily gone anywhere. So I think it's back with me at the moment. So yeah, but a lot of things get optioned, and not a lot of them get actually adapted.
Yeah, and I'm sure. I mean, sometimes how it goes. It goes and comes around, and sometimes people get to think better, or they find a good option, and they think, okay, this would be the perfect time to have Rebel of the Suns or the whole trilogy going on screen. So
yeah, exactly. It's trends. It's I think a lot of times things get made because they can see that other things work, and so. like they make something in space and all of a sudden we see a million space movies. So once we get to our desert trend, I'll be on top of that.
Exactly. But anyway, there has been like a small surge, I think, of fantasy YA novels, which have been, you know, inspired by this whole desert word, if you come to think about it. And I was just wondering, because you also mentioned Shadow and Bone, and I know that most of the, you know, fantasy YA authors have some sort of a clique, how do we call it, in which, you know, they keep thanking each other in acknowledgements, they keep mentioning each other, that they've been supporting each other, and everything seems to be so great. And I was wondering, you have such a, you know, clique of friends, and if you're like exchanging tips and tricks and whatever.
I think it's definitely, I always use this example to talk why it's important to have writer friends, because I think like you need people who will just understand you on a shorthand. So I sold my first book in October or November. And when I told my friends I didn't know any writers at the time, and I told, you know, friends, and the question that every single one of them asked me was, oh my gosh, will I be able to buy it in time for Christmas? Which, like, that would be absurd, you know, like we had just sold it. It's usually about 2 years from the time you sell a book to it actually hitting shelves. And so I was like, yes. And, you know, this was November 2014. And I was like, yeah, you'll be able to buy it for Christmas 2016, not now, you know, kind of thing. So, so there's a lot of that thing sometimes with, you know, when you have a stressor or something or a complication in life, in your writing life, when you try to talk to your non-writer friends about it, you then have to explain what the problem is. Whereas with a writer, you can just say, oh, my editor, this and this and this. And they'll be like, oh my God, that's the worst. Rather than them be like, what? What's the problem? And, you know, and so I think we definitely are able to support each other in that way. And I'm always excited to read my friends' works and, you know, get feedback from them if they have time. I had a very helpful call with actually a publishing person, though not a writer. My friend Nina while she was publicist at Faber, had read an early draft of a book, and I needed to work out something plot wise. So I called her because she'd already read it. So I didn't have to explain what was currently happening and then how I was thinking of changing it. I was like, just remember that scene? I was thinking of changing it to this. Do you think that makes sense to you? Like, you know, and she was like, yeah, I think that makes sense. And so just being able to talk it through with, you know, with someone writery is nice. So yeah, it's important, I think, because otherwise you're not, you know, it can be a lonely thing writing. You spend a lot of time staring at your computer screen.
Yeah, that's perfectly true. And since you were talking about emotions, I was really wondering if, you know, your mood or if your certain state of mind, do they get between the pages? Do they influence your characters? How much of yourself can we find between the pages?
I'm thinking, I mean, this is a completely silly example. I was exhausted when I was writing Traitor to the Throne because I was still working like part-time. I was working 4 days a week and then writing the other 3 days. I didn't have a holiday or a day off for I think 6 months. And so that was just when I was drafting it. So then when I was editing it, I had to delete so many instances of Amani going to sleep. Like every chapter would end with her being like, and then I went and had a nap. And I was like, oh, that was because I wanted to have a nap when I was writing
wishful thinking, yeah.
And all I could do was caffeine. And my friend Samantha Shannon, who writes The Priory of the Orange Tree and the Bone Season trilogy, she's all cold all the time, so her characters are always taking hot baths. It's like these silly little things that we have to go through and be like, yep, no, that wasn't, the character did not need to take a hot bath, I was cold. Or, you know, so I think it sort of inserts itself a little bit in that way. Otherwise, I think sometimes I can find it's the other way. Like if I've written something really upsetting, I sometimes find myself a bit hard to like pulling out of it. Like I'll find myself like a little bit upset or like a little bit snippy with people, and they're like, "What's wrong?" And it's like something fictional. It's not like you haven't done. There's actually nothing wrong in my life. It's just that I've been entrenched in like writing a really
like
sad
a phantom
scene.
limb or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. You sort of almost have to like resurface from the book a little bit after you've been really entrenched in drafting.
And we're seeing now a very appropriate, I would say, question in the chat. Writing can be an emotionally draining and stressful pursuit. Any tips or advice for someone just starting out? What would you say were the first steps in writing a novel?
Okay, so I definitely have writing advice I can give. I always find it tricky to give writing advice because it works differently for everyone. Everyone has their own methods. Everyone has, the things that work for them, and what works for one book might not work for another. I think it's a myth to say, there's lots of people who say, if you don't write every day, you're not a writer. I don't write every day. I have some days I, take Christmas off and spend it with my family and things like that. But something I tend to do that works for me if I've been writing sort of all day Monday is I'll take Tuesday off and do other work or housework or whatever, or like, in order to not completely deplete the tank, because otherwise sometimes I find, you can put a lot of pressure on yourself. And if you're just starting out, it can be a little bit tricky to just sort of keep yourself motivated, through the middle. I think most people I talk to get to about 20 or 30,000 words and then they get demotivated because they knew how the beginning was and they know what the end is, but the middle is always a little bit trickier. And that will be extra problematic if you are forcing yourself to write all the time. I'm not saying only write when the mood strikes you, because then you'll never get anything done. It is work, but don't put pressure on yourself of like, I have to do 5,000 words every day or whatever. If you do 5,000 words in a day, great. The maximum I've ever done, I think, was 6,000. And if you do 50 words the next day, that's also fine. But it's just sort of keep going. It's gradual. And give yourself a bit of a break. But also something I like to do is have things that I'm excited to get to. So I don't plan out the book sort of beat by beat, but I know, okay, there's going to be a scene where they jump off a moving train and I'm really excited to get to that scene. That's going to be a really fun scene to write. So if I just write the next 5,000 words, then I get to write the moving train
so it's like
and that'll
treat.
be really fun. So I sort of motivate myself by being excited to get to the next thing. So it's a bit like, it's like a reward. It's like, if I go to the gym, I can eat this chocolate cake, except if it's like, if I write this bit that I'm not sure about and I feel insecure about, then I can write the really exciting action-packed scene, or I can write the great kiss, or I can write, whatever I'm really excited to get to. And yeah, it's truly just put one word in front of the other, one foot in front of the other, and eventually you'll get to the end, even if you only wrote 50 words a day.
I really think you're the first writer who's ever, mentioned treats in writing form. So okay, if I write this and that, and I'm going to get there, it sounds like a very, very, very nice thing to do. Bianca, please.
Yes, hello, I'm happy to meet you.
Hi.
And my question is, what are some of your fantasy favorite books that you read?
Ooh, good question. Well, I would mention, I'm looking at my bookshelves now. They're right in front of me, so this works very well. I think my first fantasy love was the Song of the Lioness Alana series by Tamora Pierce, which are so wonderful. I thought she invented girls dressing up as boys to do badass things. She obviously didn't, but in my 10-year-old mind, she did. Those are some of my all-time favorites. I also was really inspired by Robin McKinley's The Blue Sword, which is a desert setting. So I think that is also shows in Rebel. I love Shadow and Bone. I love Six of Crows, as I mentioned. I also really loved Maria Rutkowski's The Winter's Curse series, which, if you haven't read it, I won't tell you what it's about. I'll just tell you how it made me feel, which is that I started reading it like 9 p.m. going, I'll read a couple of chapters before I go to sleep. And the next thing I knew, I was finishing it. It was 3 a.m. I had rotated 180 degrees in my bed from just being like, what? No, like just thrashing around. And I literally out loud to no one at 3 a.m. went, no, why? And then the next morning in work, I was like, I looked completely shattered, obviously, and everyone was like, are you okay? And I was like, I can't tell them I'm in deep emotional distress about fictional characters. So I was like, I didn't sleep very well. So that was one. I loved, I don't know if it's fantasy, but I loved Heidi Halig's The Girl from Everywhere, which is time travel, which is excellent. I could go on. I'm literally looking at my shelves. I loved Ray Carson's The Girl of Fire and Thorn series. That's also an excellent one. I feel like I've given you a pretty solid reading list there. But yeah, I'm definitely a sucker for fantasy. But those are some top ones.
Yeah, that's an amazing list, Alwyn. To be honest, I thought no one has ever read the Alana series except myself, but apparently there
You
you
need to
go.
come to the UK, everyone, or the US, everyone, like writers my age I've met are obsessed with it now. No one I
Really?
knew growing up was obsessed with it. So.
I'm so happy to hear about it because Tamora has another series, the one delving in magic and witchcraft and stuff. But I really didn't get into that one. But Alana was something from another world, so I really
I
loved
love
it.
Alana so much. I
Yeah,
wanted to be a redhead so badly
there you
as a
go.
child. Between her and Anne of Green Gables, I wanted to be a redhead so much.
Yeah, understandable completely. Okay, thank you, Bianca, so much.
Thank you,
Delia,
Bianca.
I think it's your turn.
Hi, I have two questions. If you could rewrite Rebel of the Sands, what would you change?
Ooh, interesting question. I think that's a dangerous game to play because the answer is either nothing or everything. Because if you give an author too much time, we will just rewrite forever. We'll be like, well, maybe she should go over here. Maybe she should go over there. So I think I would struggle to reread it now because I would say, oh, I would change this, I would change that. I'm trying to think if there's anything very specific I would change. I might cede a couple of things that happened in the third book early, which I didn't know were going to happen in the third book until I wrote the third book. But other than that, I think I would leave it as is, hopefully.
And which part of the Rebel of the Sands was the hardest to write?
Which part was the hardest to write? Of the first book or the whole series?
The whole series.
The whole series. This is so spoilery. Okay. The hardest to write in terms of like the thing I didn't want to do is that there is a character who dies towards the end of the third book who I didn't think was going to die. I went through the entire series imagining that they were in the epilogue and that they were going to live and then the more I wrote it, the more it became apparent that it made sense for them to die. And I so much didn't want to do it that I had them sort of magically saved in this really improbable way in my first draft. And my editor kind of circled it and they were like, what's this? I thought that they had died and then they still seem to be alive. I'm so confused. And I was like, yes, no, I know that they have to die, but I just felt really bad about it. So I wanted to leave them alive for just one draft. So just give me this. And they were like, okay, but you need to kill them now. And I was like, yeah, I know. And I just felt so horrible about doing it. But it was the right plot decision to make for that character to die, but it was a very difficult thing for me to bring myself to do. And I think people are still mad at me about it. That's what else I can say without spoilers.
Yeah, but now for us who have read just the first or the second volume of the series, now you've made us think who this might be. So now we're going to focus only on this thing.
I mean, you can keep guessing. There are more than a few deaths in the series. But yeah.
Matei, it's your turn.
Hi, Alwyn.
Hi.
I wanted to say that Rebel of the Sands is my favorite book. I love it.
Thank you so much.
My question is, what character do you think matches your personality the most?
Ooh, what character matches my personality the most? The one who I instinctively want to say, just out of egotism, is Shazad. I'm not nearly as smart or as brave as her, but I think she sort of most closely matches like my life in a way. She's an older sister to a younger brother, which I am as well. She's the only character with a stable home life and who doesn't have parents who are completely terrible. And she, and I think she sort of has never let herself be held back by gender roles, which is something that I think I like to think about myself as well, is that I was never someone who was like, oh, well, girls can't do this as a kid. So I think she is a smarter, braver, prettier, better version of me. But otherwise, I think a lot of them have a little bit of me in it, with the possible exception of Hala, who cannot get my head around that girl. I write her, and half the time I'm like, what are you thinking? So yeah, that's my answer, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's so cool, Alwyn. I actually love Shazad, so it's nice to hear that it's actually you in disguise.
Oh God, now I've set up expectations. You're going to be so disappointed in me in real life.
No, by no means. I can see like there was a hand risen, I think. Anna, just a second, because I have a question in the chat, and then you're next. Jenny is asking you, Alwyn, do you think studying writing at university helped? And what's your opinion on self-teaching?
So I didn't study writing at all. I certainly know people who have in various forms, whether it's sort of writing novels, or there are authors who write novels who studied script writing and movie making and found it a different way. A lot of people who write haven't studied it, I will say, for various reasons. You know, some it's just the availability. Like, I don't actually know where I would have gone to study writing necessarily, but I wouldn't say that it's not useful, but it's not something that I think I would have thrived in personally. I don't even have a degree in English. I grew up in France. I studied French literature. I have never, well, I have now, but I had never, you know, when I came to university, read most of the things that you're supposed to have read, you know, the classics and things like that. And for me, it was really just practice. You know, it was wanting to write, getting up, you know, in the morning and writing a little bit before work, or writing after work, or writing on the weekend instead of going out, or instead of watching TV. So I think I would say it sort of really depends on the availability and whether it's the right course for you, but also on knowing yourself. If you're someone who is not going to have the discipline or the courage or whatever it is to write without sort of a formalized thing around you, then maybe a writing course is good for you. If you're someone who loves to write anyway, and you'll do it in your spare time and in your evenings, you're getting the practice that you would get. I think it also probably depends, you know, if you wanted to be a screenwriter, then maybe there is a screenwriting course that you should do. Or if you want to be a journalist, there probably are journalism courses and things like that. But I mean, again, I'm looking at my shelves, you know, I know what some of these authors were doing when they sold their first book. One of them was a receptionist, you know, one of them was a school administrator. One of them worked, you know, at a publication around books, but didn't actually, you know, write herself. So I don't think it's a necessity, but I think it's sort of about knowing what you need in order to get started writing.
Yeah, this sounds like a very sound encouragement. I mean, we all know about, you know, these successful stories of so many authors who have been doing something completely different. And I can remember, Alwyn, that you yourself were saying in an interview that you've only recently when you've given the interview, started becoming a full-time writer, because before you actually had a job, right? A day job and everything.
Yeah, no, I worked at Christie's, the auction house, for I guess 6 years, and I left January of 2016, and then my first book was published a couple of months later. And the only reason I was going to say the only reason I was lucky enough to be able to leave because the book sold for enough money that I could self-support. So that's also a case of a lot of authors do have to have second jobs because, you know, the books will sell for less than what a year's salary is. And so you need to be able to eat and live and things like that. So a lot of authors do have second jobs. I was in a position where I was lucky because I had made enough that I could leave, and felt okay in that. But also I was either going to have to give up my job writing or sleep at some point. And I really like sleep. So I had to give up my job.
Yeah, that sounds like the best choice. I mean, at least for our sake as your readers. Roxo, I think it's your turn to ask a question.
Yay, thank you. Hi.
Hi.
I'm a bit fangirling right now. I'm way above the young adult age of your books.
I'd never tell. You look 16.
Thank you. I have 3, almost 4 kids.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So I read your books, the 3 of them, in almost a week.
Oh my gosh. Thank you.
Yeah. With the kids begging me for a bedtime story. And I was like, how about I tell you about this book I'm reading right now? Yeah. So when we went to sleep, they kept telling me, Mom, can you tell us something more about Amani? And yeah, the kids
I need to write a kid's version of it.
Oh, well, yeah, I trimmed the violent parts of it because my eldest one is almost 7. So I was amazed at how excellent your writing was, and your storytelling is wow. And when I read that this was your debut novel, I was kind of discouraged because as an aspiring writer, I'm nowhere as good as Rebel of the Sands is. So my question is, what is one writing exercise that you did that helped you the most?
Well, first of all, I would say don't be discouraged, because you should never compare your work in progress to my finished product, because I can assure you, when I started writing altogether, but B, when I started writing Rebel, it didn't read like it does in the finished product. It read better. Rebel read better than the previous things I'd written. But please also remember, like, it goes through multiple rounds of editing, line editing, copy editing, until it's like been polished by a lot of people. It's not just me working on that. All you can ask of yourself is to just make something the best that you can make it. And then if it is hopefully good enough, then other professionals will, come in and be like, help bring out the best of your writing. So that's something very important, I would say. And I say this to you as knowing I have to take that note myself, because like when I started writing Traitor, Rebel was so polished and perfect, and then Traitor sucked, and I was like, oh God, I've got to, and so I was like trying not to compare my first, draft of Traitor to the Throne to my finished, copy of Rebel. I would say that the thing that helps me the most is, well, like I said, it's writing is like, playing a sport or an instrument. It's practice. If you do it enough, eventually you'll be good enough. And that might mean writing 6 full books that aren't very good, and then writing one that is, or writing the same book over 6 times, which I know another author who did that. But something that I really did a lot of was a lot of daydreaming, that I think is completely underrated in terms of being part of your writing process, is because I would spend a lot of time, especially commuting to work on a very crowded tube where I couldn't read. Like, there's people jammed in like this, like I couldn't open a book to save my life. So I would spend time on the train sort of staring into space and imagining the next step in the story and getting really excited about it. Like, I think I was literally on the train when I thought, oh, there should be a scene where they're being chased on the train and then they have to jump off of a moving train and they have to do the fake out makeup, and like, and that all came to me as I was daydreaming. And I think that's a really important part, because you kind of, then when you sit down on the page, you're excited about what you're going to get to write, but also it gives your brain space to come up with fun ideas rather than sitting down and forcing yourself to be like, well, this is like, grinding and all that. And then the other thing is, I would say, like, a lot of my first drafts will look like this. She felt sad and full of sadness and was sorrowful. And then I go back and fix it. So don't beat yourself up if your first draft looks like she was full of sadness and was very sad, because that's what mine looked like. But I sort of do a thing, and this is only the way it works for me. I know, for instance, Laini Taylor, who writes such beautiful prose, writes like those beautiful words right off the bat, whereas I'm much more likely to write 5,000 terrible words and then go back and fix them. But I sort of look at it a little bit like, you can use any analogy you want, a bit like making a cake. You have to make sure that what you want in it is really like this number of eggs, this much flour, this before you bake it and frost it and make it all pretty. There's no point frosting a cake that is not right. So don't stress too much about like the words being beautiful until you've got the plot and the story nailed down. So that's what I do, is I'll sort of scaffold it up and go, this happens here, and then I'll go, oh, actually chapter 2 doesn't need to happen that way because now this happens in chapter 5, so I could just cut chapter 2, and then I'm glad I didn't spend 5 hours agonizing over word choice in chapter 2. So that's sort of my technique, is get to the end and you can fix it later.
Oh, thank you. That's a very, very
and good luck.
Point. Thank you.
Don't beat yourself up.
Just another small question. How much do you spend outlining, writing, and then revising? As percents, not necessarily time.
Yeah, I think I kind of have a rough idea in my mind. I don't really outline ahead of time because otherwise it feels a little bit like I might as well be writing. So I sort of outline as I go, and then I'll always hit a point in the book where I have to stop and then recalibrate myself. And that I like to do on paper with a pen. And so I'll sort of go, okay, this happens, then this happens, and okay, well, maybe that doesn't need to happen, kind of thing. But I always get a little bit further into it before I outline. So it's kind of a drafting, then outlining, then more drafting, then editing is my process. I hope that helps.
Thank you. So you're a pantser. Got it.
Pretty much, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Good. So let me just check, because now we are full of questions and I'd like to see if the order is correct. So Madalina, I think you're next in line.
Yeah, hi. It's so nice meeting you.
Hi.
My question is, what was the most surprising thing that you discovered while writing your books?
Ooh. The most surprising thing. I think this is going to sound so silly. It was the strange words that I overused and used that I never noticed were such a big part of my vocabulary until people started flagging it to me. And once you sort of realized how much you say certain words, you can't unhear it. I don't say like slammed anymore. Like people, like there was, I wrote in the first draft of Revel, everyone was slamming into things and slamming against walls and slamming into action. And now I feel, I was like, I've been tainted from that word. I can't use it anymore. So I think it's the little quirks you discover about writing as you do it, as someone else sort of starts to look at your writing. But the weirdest moment, I have to say, because I'm not someone who shares my writing with sort of people until it's done. So one of the weirdest moments I had was when I first spoke to my agent, when she was offering representation to me, and she said Amani's name. It was the first time I'd ever heard it out loud, because I'd not talked about the book to anyone. I hadn't shown it to anyone. And the thing that went into my brain that was so shocking, I was like, how do you know about Amani? Like, it was like, I was like suspicious almost. And I was like, right, no, I let her read my book. So that was a very weird moment that sticks in my brain, is the first moment I heard my main character's name out loud.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bianca, I think you're next in line to ask a second question.
Yes, so my other question is about writing and stuff. So I'm writing my book and I'm trying to figure out the villain of the story. And I know that the villain has to be also emotional sometimes and have and think that they are doing something right. But how do you keep it as a villain then? Because sometimes it doesn't seem like it.
Sure. I mean, I talk about this for rebellions in general. The French Revolution, the reason it's viewed well is because they won. Same thing for the American Revolution. If a revolution doesn't win, best case scenario, you're viewed as sort of a Les Mis situation. You're viewed as like idealist who it didn't go well for. Worst case scenario, you're viewed as a villain or a terrorist, kind of thing. There are definitely revolutions that haven't gone well. And so I think it is a lot about point of view, because most people in reality, they're psychopaths, but very few people wake up thinking, well, today I'm looking forward to kicking a puppy and punching a baby. You know what I mean? Like, that's not very realistic. So I think it's crucial that they think that they're doing the right thing, but it can be for selfish reasons, like a selfish person, they're doing the right thing, but it's for them. And, and it compromises 100 other people, like vampires killing people is selfish. You know, they're depriving other people their life, but for them, they're doing the right thing because they're keeping themselves alive, you know, kind of thing. So I think it's a point of view thing, and that can be that the thing that they're doing right is compromising what we view as general morals of like, well, I'm doing the right thing, but in order to do it, I have to kill 100 people. And it's like, well, is that the right thing then? You know, kind of thing. So I think it's that's the tension that's interesting for me is, you know, in their mind, what is important to them is not what's important to the hero and the point of view character, and hopefully to us as the reader. So, you know, you'll see a million people, not a million people, but there's plenty of people who around the time of the Avengers movies were like, Thanos was right, the world is overpopulated. So, you know, you can sort of play with that interestingly, I think.
Thank you for answering.
Thank you.
And since you mentioned puppies, I was wondering, are you a cat or a dog person?
Ooh, I grew up with a dog, so I'm partly a dog person, but I had a black cat who was visiting me throughout the pandemic, who I befriended. And I was constantly all over my Instagram, and people were like, it's your spirit animal, he's visiting you. I haven't seen him in a while. So I'm sort of in between now, but my heart belongs to dogs, I think.
Okay, I'll forgive you for that.
Sorry,
okay, just because you're right. Excellent
in my garden a
fiction.
while ago, and so now I think I'm a fox person.
Foxes, yeah, definitely, they're my favorites. There you are, we're on the same page.
I had a baby fox stuck in my garden for 3 days.
Oh, lucky you, because you live in England and such things happen.
I was so scared for him. It was a whole adventure.
I can imagine. Anna, I think you're next with a question.
Alwyn, I wanted to ask something. Actually, 2 things. First off is, who was your favorite or most exciting character to write out of the whole series?
Ooh, I love writing Sam. I know it's just that he came in the second book, so I'm going to try not to be too spoilery for people who haven't read Trader. But he is a character who's not from the desert, and he's sort of not initially part of the revolution, and he just was very lighthearted and fun, and he's sort of there for him, and he's going to do whatever he wants, and he's sort of a bit of a like wild card, and so I really always looked forward to getting to write him in the second and third book. Yeah, just a really fun character to write, and it was very hard to find, because I realized that I was naming, you know, all of my desert characters had sort of quite unusual names. I've met readers since with named Amani and named, you know, names after the desert. But at the time I was trying to think of sort of a quite generic English boy's name. And the trouble of finding one whose name I didn't know someone by that name was troublesome. I was like, Tom's my dad's name. This person, well, that's my friend's husband. And then a friend has now started dating and has now married someone named Sam. So I was like, well, you've ruined it. So I was like, I didn't know any Sams very closely before him, so named him Sam. It was a really troublesome thing.
Okay. And the second question is, what was the first push that made you start writing? For me, I've been trying to start writing something, but I always feel like I'm stuck and I have a wall up, and I just start writing and then I stop.
That's interesting. I think like I always wrote as a kid. I sort of more or less stopped in university because I didn't have that much time. But I think I basically had a year after university where I had to move back to France before I could go back to the UK for work and blah, blah, blah. It was a whole situation. And I think there was a part of me that felt like I should make use of this year. And so I was like, you know, I sort of in a safe place, you know, I'm taken care of with my family and things like that. So now's a good time to do it. And I think what you're talking about with the wall is interesting. I think that for me, the thing that I remind myself of is just, no one has to see this. If I don't like it, if it's not good enough, if I'm not happy with it, no one has to see this but me, you know? And then it just becomes fun, you know, because if there's plenty of people who paint artwork without thinking like, oh, it'll go in a gallery one day. But even if your ultimate goal might be to write for people to see, they don't have to until you're ready. So you can just take your time. You can chill at home You know, it's like spending a day in your pajamas. Like, no one has to see me if I don't choose to go out. No one has to see your writing if you don't choose to share it with the world. So I think it's that. And I think it's also, I try not to get daunted by thinking, oh God, I've written 100 words and I have to write 80,000 more. It's like, I've written 100 words. Well done, me. Maybe I'll write 100 more tomorrow, rather than think of like, I have to do, you know, this thing. I think if you don't enjoy it, you will make yourself crazy. So you have to find ways to make yourself enjoy it, you know.
Thanks.
My pleasure.
Alwyn, we also have a question in our chat, which is about death. And Yanela is asking you, what is your opinion about death, especially now with the whole pandemic situation?
Death in fiction?
Yanela, can you help us? Like death in fiction or death in reality?
Above, if in reality or in fiction.
So both of them, Alwyn.
So this is so interesting because I was having, I'm looking at it over there. My friend recently had her second baby, and she has named both her babies after characters from Little Women, Beth and Joe, not intentionally, but she's done it. One's named after Empress Josephine, one's named after Queen Elizabeth. So I got her a baby book of Little Women, which I'm about to spoil her Little Women if people haven't seen it, but very famously, one of the sisters dies in Little Women. And I was having to flip through the baby book to see whether, because it's literally for babies, whether they glossed over the death or not. And they didn't. You know, they don't use the word death, but she is gone. And then similarly, I was talking to a friend about this who was writing a picture book, and he said, you know, there's a character in it who it's for children, but there's a character who falls asleep and doesn't wake up, and I'm not sure whether that's appropriate for children, all that and that sort of thing. And it's not something I have a definite answer to. I think in fiction, as much as it's part of our reality, in fiction, I don't like gratuitous death. And it's one of the, and I think, you know, it's sort of with the pandemic, like obviously there has been a lot of very unfortunate gratuitous death in the past year that has been really heartbreaking and really tragic. I think the beauty of fiction is that we get to have a little bit more control over our world that we create and that we write. So deaths don't have to be random, you know, they can serve story, or they can serve arcs, or they serve greater things. And that's what I find interesting in fiction. I think it is depending on what genre you're writing, I think it's a mistake to shy away from death, because like if everyone had survived the rebellion, people would be telling me that was really unrealistic, and I think I would feel really like it was a bit too much of a happy ending. Like I'm not writing for, you know, for 10-year-olds, I'm writing for teenagers and above. So I think, you know, there has to be serious consequences and stakes for things to matter. But by the same token, I've never liked in fiction when someone is killed off for shock value, or, you know, or it feels unearned in whatever way. I've never liked that. I stopped watching House after one of the characters commit suicide for no reason. And, you know, it was just because that character went to work, you know, elsewhere, the actor. But I just remember getting so angry that was how they chose to exit the character, because it felt so unearned. And, you know, and so I really am troubled by deaths that are completely pointless in fiction, or feel like they're there to shock the reader, especially because we do come to fiction to make sense of the real world. So that's my slight serious answer.
Thank you so much, Alwyn, for sharing all this with us. We also have a question which is not as philosophical, but rather pragmatic. What books on writing do you recommend? And if you have especially some books related to the young adult genre?
Oh, I don't think I have any. I am bad at reading books about writing. Someone I remember, ones that have been recommended before that I've heard that have helped other people are Save the Cat, which is a screenwriting book, which I know some people have found helpful. I think it's a little bit like structured. It's like this, then this, then this, but I think it can teach you the basic story beats. I think there's one that's the picture on the front is like a pencil, and I think it's just called On Story, and I can't remember who it's by, and I cannot look it up right now without fully looking away from the screen for far too long. But I'm sort of bad on that. I'm afraid. I'm sure other authors have shared things that have helped them more. For me, I've always been much more like a learn by doing sort of thing. So I will often read something in a book that I'm like, oh, that's interesting how they developed this character, da 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 da, and then that will be in the back of my mind. So I think for me, it's important to read fiction critically, or something really works, get excited about, be like, oh, I see why this works, or something really doesn't work, maybe take the time, instead of being like, this book is crap, take the time to be like, well, how could it have worked? What would I have changed in order to make it work? That's sort of, I think, what I do a lot of the time. But I'm sorry that I don't have a great answer for that.
Yeah, it's sort of practice makes perfect in the end, even if, practice means reading and not writing in the end.
Yeah.
Amalia, please.
Yes, hello, nice to meet you. My question is related to writing. And it's basically how do you know when to stop writing? When do you say like, okay, this is the end, I have to stop this is the best I can do right now? Because and then you move on, because I just started writing my first draft, and I haven't finished it yet, but I'm already thinking about how to change a lot of things, and I'm afraid I will just end stuck in the editing process forever.
That's fair. I mean, I think a lot of that can happen in a lot of cases, and you can get stuck in places where you're, and you're just you're nitpicking instead of actually editing. I think that's the danger, is you absolutely do want to edit until it's right. Here's the thing I would say is, when you're finished, put it to the side for like a few weeks, 3 weeks, a month, something like that, so that you can go in with fresh eyes, and go in a little bit more critically, because you're probably a little bit close to it having just finished it. So I think it's always a good idea to take a little bit of a break from it, and then you can come in and feel a bit more calm and go, okay, I want to change this, I want to change this, I want to change this. I think the point where you're like fiddling with like adjectives, at that point you're fiddling. If you're changing pretty to beautiful to gorgeous to pretty, like that sort of thing. But if you still feel like, okay, it's not working that my main character is a journalist, maybe she needs to be a spy or whatever, that is still, big picture stuff to do. But also I think for me, I always found it important to do something else that makes me feel confident when I was drafting Rebel. And I know this is going to sound odd, but I would always find, like, a lot of the times if we had like 3-day weekends, I'd spend all 3 days writing. And by the end of the third day, I would have lost my mind. And I would be like, okay, well, this doesn't work, but maybe it would work if all the characters, instead of being humans, all the characters were dragons. And then that's where, you're losing your mind. And then I would go back to work the next day. My job took up a lot of time, but it was also something I was good at and that I had external validation in. And so I would sort of then end the week being like, oh, I'm actually a sane, competent human being. And when I go back and look at the book, I'm like, no, they should still be humans. Don't make everyone a dragon. That would be crazy. So I think, like, if you're starting to feel that way, like, oh my God, like, do I need to change everything? Maybe step away, do something that, isn't anything to do with writing, that's not reading a book, whether it's like playing a sport you're good at or whatever, and be like, no, I'm a good human being. This doesn't need to be, I feel confident. I think a lot of it is about confidence, because a lot of the fiddling is like, you're scared that it's not good enough. And it's also knowing when to step away and like leave something for a while to sit to think about, but also when to step away and work on something else. I was talking earlier about the almost book I wrote before Rebel. I now could fix that book. I couldn't at the time. I did not have that in me to fix the book at the time. With everything I've learned from writing the Rebel of the Sands trilogy, I've learned the lessons that I need to in order to rewrite that book. So I couldn't have done it 3 years ago. I could absolutely do it now. I'm not saying take a 3-year break, but just, sometimes you'll want to sort of step away and come back, and you'll like, oh, now that I've learned something new from reading this book or writing this other project, I absolutely see what to do with this one. So
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and Alwyn, what do you intend to do? Are you planning to actually publish that first book you were mentioning now that you can fix it?
Oh, like it would be a full rewrite. I think it's it would be like a future project. It's not, wouldn't be the next thing, but it's maybe the next thing.
Yeah,
I always have there's something I like to do, which is that I always have a project that I am psychologically cheating on my current book with. So I, you know, the book that I'm writing is my committed relationship, but there's always another idea that sort of I like to fantasize about, because when you sit down to actually write the book, it goes from being fun and exciting to actually being work, which is good. It's part of the process, but I don't, you know, want to go to bed thinking about the book that is my work. So I go to bed, you know, daydreaming or thinking about the next thing I'm going to write, which is still a fun idea. The trick is not to actually cheat on the book that you're writing with a new idea. Rachel Hawkins always calls it the like siren book, you know, so there's another book that's like a siren, you know, whispering, being like, write me instead. And it's always a trap, because then you're writing two things instead of just writing one. So that book, the Almost book, is my cheating book at the moment. So I'm in a committed relationship with the book I'm writing, but I am sort of daydreaming and figuring out, but it would be a complete rewrite. It was first person point of view. It would need to be multiple points of view. I think I'd have to completely rejig the world building. The plot would have to change a fair bit. It would still be the same central theme, but it would be a rewrite. So it's not like I could just dive in and be like, this chapter works as is. It would be a lot of work.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see how it works, and I think we readers would rather, you know, wait and see how it goes and take it slowly,
rather than have 3 half-formed books from me.
Yeah. Maybe just another fully, you know, formed,
yeah, exactly, one that's actually written.
Yeah, perfect. Guys, I would just gonna mention to you that we are reaching the end of this lovely conversation. I'm sure you all are very sad about this, and since I already see 2 questions waiting on the chat, I will read them, and then I'd kindly ask you to prepare your last round of questions for Alwyn. So, you know, show of hands, or just write to me in the chat, and this is the last round we're going to take. So we're going to start with Anna's question. What is your opinion on writing cliches like enemies to lovers, the chosen one? From a writer's perspective, are they as overused as people make them out to be?
Listen, I think cliches are cliches for a reason. And the reason that they're cliches is because they work. The reason people keep using them is because they're effective, is that, you know, they resonate in some way. That means cliches in terms of even like, yes, of course, it's a cliche to say black is night, but that's, you know, immediately conjures an image to people. And that's why people always use that metaphor, for instance. And so I think for me, it's entirely in the execution. You know, for instance, the boarding school book, you could say what is very overdone. You know, I read the Worst Witch series when I was a kid. And I remember when Harry Potter came out, I was like, oh, another boarding school about people with magic. This is so derivative of the Worst Witch. And of course, it's completely different and also wildly successful. So I think, you know, as long as you put your own spin on it, I don't see any problem with using cliches. I mean, one of my all-time favorite cliches is the fake out, make out, where you're like, oh, someone's coming, we have to kiss to hide. It's a complete cliche. I love it. I use it in the first book. So I don't really have a problem with it. I always think, I mean, here's the #1 best piece of writing advice that I've ever gotten from anyone, which is, instead of trying to think of it like, think of an idea that no one else has ever thought of, because that will terrorize you. That's like if I shouted at you, like, don't think of the color blue. Now all you can think of is blue. So it's like, as soon as I said, think of an idea that no one else has ever thought of, all you can be is like, it's Harry Potter, it's the Avengers, it's, you know, whatever. But if you reframe that as, think of an idea that only you would write, that essentially means the same thing as think of something original, but it's sort of coming from more internal. So that might mean, you know, for instance, for me, as we talked about at the beginning, I have a huge part of my life that was dedicated to studying the French Revolution. So I wrote a revolution. I worked when I was at Christie's, I worked in Islamic art and Oriental rugs and carpets. So I wrote something with sort of that cultural background. And none of these individually are completely original, but they're just weird little different things that come together in me that combine. So, you might, as a silly example would be like, your main character might have whatever your worst fear is, or your main character might have 12 siblings because you're the eldest of 12 siblings, like little things. I don't mean you have to pull exactly from your life, but things that are unique to you. Like I wouldn't know how to authentically write a giant family because it's just me and my brother, kind of thing. So I think just sort of, as long as you're intertwining those cliches with things that are unique to your writing style or your voice, or things that you're interested in or afraid of or fascinated by, then I don't see a problem with using them. And I love enemies to lovers. It's one of my faves.
Yeah, as we can see, it's one of the readership's favorites as well. Question from Jenny: how did you choose the world in which your book series is happening?
The first beginning of the idea was that I wanted to write a female sharpshooter. And then the immediate next thought was, I do not want to write this in actual Old West times. I think, I could have had magic in it, but I find things less interesting when the scope can't be as epic when you're dealing with actual history, because that they didn't turn over the government or whatever the case may be. So I knew I wanted to set it in the Second World. And so I was thinking about it. And then all of a sudden it kind of occurred to me how many similarities the settings of 1001 Nights and the setting of a Western were, in that they both sort of get around by horse, and there's desert, and there's a strong place of religion. And, it's kind of, there's sort of bandits. It's sort of a big part of the mythology. And then the two big things that clashed were the magic in one and the technology in the other. So I put those together to kind of compete. So sort of that's actually a really good example of what I was talking about earlier about daydreaming. Is I was literally lying in bed staring at the ceiling going, Wild West meets, what could it be? What could it be? And it sort of came to me in the middle of the night, and I texted a friend being like, is this insane? She was asleep. So by the time she texted me back going, it's a little insane, I'd already talked myself into it. So I think, yeah, I sort of made it make sense.
We have Matei with another question.
What are you currently working on? What's your current project?
So I'm currently working on a book called The Notorious Virtues, which is the first in a duology. And my pitch is that it is 1920s magical heiresses of New York meets grim fairy tales. So it is taking longer than expected, partly because of the pandemic, but it's set in the same world as Rebel of the Sands, I can say, but a different country and some years later. And there was one character who crosses over, who is the grandmother of one of the characters from Rebel, who was a teenager when they were last seen, is now the grandmother of one of the characters from Notorious, who is my secret fave, the character from Notorious.
Spoiler alert!
Yeah.
It sounds very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the advantages when you're a fantastic world builder. Then you get to keep writing and writing and writing in the same universe, and it never ends.
That's what I'm excited to do. I'm excited to get to explore beyond the borders of the desert, because as much as you do meet foreign people, they never do actually leave the desert. So it was nice to be somewhere else, but in a familiar world.
Yeah, it's always true. Bianca, I think you're next for a question.
Yes. So how important do you think it is to let other people read what you're writing? Because I don't know, sometimes I feel like it's not ready to be shown to other people, and I don't want for them to read it.
If you don't want people to read it, you don't have to. I didn't let anyone read my stuff until it went to my agent. I think there's also I think it can be helpful if you actually consciously need something or want feedback. But I think it can be quite dangerous to ask for feedback, especially from other writers, because a lot of writers I know are not good editors. And I mean that in the nicest way possible. So like a good editor, they will say, like, this is a silly example, but say you had a unicorn in the book and it wasn't quite working. A good editor will tell you, the unicorn isn't quite working, let's fix it. A bad editor will tell you, the unicorn isn't working, you should make it a dragon, which is not helpful advice, because if you left your own advice, maybe you'd make the unicorn better, maybe you change the unicorn into a griffin, you would do something else. That's a silly, obviously, example, but that can be a good editor will tell you, like, I don't quite get this character. A bad editor would be like, well, she should be stronger, she should be nicer, she should be whatever. And a lot of writers will be the bad editor because what they think is, oh, well, if I was writing this character, what I would do is this and this and this, and impose it on you. And so I think that's the danger of letting other people read your stuff, especially before it's ready, is because either A, they'll tell you stuff that you already know, which is annoying and a waste of everyone's time, or B, they'll tell you, well, if I was doing it, I would do it this way. And you're like, and you want to be like, well, you're not doing it, I'm doing it, so back off. So I really only like my editors to read it unless I really specifically want to sit down with a writer friend or a friend and say, like, please help me I'm stuck on this plot thing. Can you help me figure out how to get from A, B to C? I don't know what B is, but I know they need to go from A to C. That can be more helpful. So you are under no obligation to share anything. Don't let anyone make you.
I also think that in your example, maybe the good editor is also imagining him or herself in the skin of readers. I think it's easier, to see how readership will see it or live it once they read it. So maybe this is how they can, be impartial or objective somehow.
Totally.
Guys, as I already mentioned, we are on our last legs here with this lovely conversation. So if any of you has another question in the oven, I would really like if you'd pop it right now. No pressure.
Fun question.
Yeah, exactly. And if not, there's no worries, because I'm sure we can always reach to Alwyn on various ways of communication, which the pandemic sort of has reinforced now. Even we don't really like it, at least it has brought us this. So first of all, I would like to thank you, Alwyn, for your patience and for your willingness to answer to all our questions.
Oh, it's been wonderful. I've loved the questions. Thank you so much.
I'm really glad you did. And I would like to also thank to the lovely readers we've had here with so many ideas and so many notions that they wanted to have, clarified or explained or whatever. And I'm the happiest because you spoiled us. You told us what you're working on. I'm really looking forward to see that now. No pressure.
Now I better get back to work on it. Gosh.
yeah. Chop. It's only Sunday evening. What else would you do?
Got the whole week ahead of me.
There you go. Okay. So just to remind us, Alwyn, where is the best place to follow you right now? Instagram, Twitter, your website, wherever.
All those things. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. I think I'm Alwyn FJH on Twitter, and I think I'm my full name, Alwyn Hamilton, on Instagram. And if you have any sort of pressing writing questions that you were too shy to ask or that you think of later, I think my Goodreads questions is open as well, so you can find me on there to pop. And I don't always remember to check, but I will make an effort to. So any other writing questions that pop up, you can find me there. But otherwise, you can see me posting pictures of my outfits on Instagram and whatever I'm watching or reading on Twitter usually. Come chat to me about writing, come chat to me about Shadow and Bone, come chat to me about anything.
And foxes.
Yes, and that. I've never had so many people as emotionally invested in my life as when I was Instagramming the fox in my backyard.
I can imagine little things, little furry
so
things
cute.
would do that for you. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Alwyn, for this lovely evening. Thank you, everyone. Thank you
so much, Julia, for being
FestivalYA.
such a wonderful moderator as well, if you'll allow me to say that. And thank you to everyone for your really wonderful questions. I hope I get to come to Romanian person one day, but until then, this will have to do.
Yay! Yeah, we'll be looking forward to that moment, Alwyn. Good luck writing, and we're looking forward to the next book. Thank you, everyone. Have
Thanks
a great
so much,
evening.
guys.